If you fear that a loan recovery agent is going to turn up at your doorstep, you're not alone. Loan recovery has become a rather infamous exercise for harassment and merciless behavior. Several complaints and plea later, the government has taken a note of the pain of common man. Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has said that the government has instructed both public and private sector banks not to take harsh steps when in the process of loan repayment, and have asked banks to handle cases with humanity and sensitivity. Remember, the Reserve Bank of India in a 2008 circular warned banks that it might consider imposing a ban for engaging with recovery agent if it receives complaints about those agents. But despite all effort, the harassment of loan recovery agents continue unabated, to the point where Madras High Court last month asked banks to refrain from using coercive action or muscle power when in process of recovering money. We could quickly have a reaction coming in from the Finance Minister. Let's play that up.
Given an answer, I would want to add something to it. The Honourable Member has raised a very sensitive issue. I know I've heard complaints about how very mercilessly the paying back has been followed up by some banks, whether they are public sector banks or private sector banks. The government has made sure, through the RBI also, to instruct such banks that such harsh steps should not be taken, and that they should approach this whole matter with a humanity in mind and sensitivity in mind. That instruction has been given to all the banks, be it private or public.
All right, that's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, of course, saying that you've got to be more human when dealing with loan recovery. Loan recovery remains a problem, not so much with public sector banks or private sector banks, largely with NBFCs. And when you take loans through these apps, there has been an attempt made by the government to tell people either not to go for these loan recovery or loan apps, and also crack down on some of these loan apps. Nonetheless, the harassment continues, Rakesh. I mean, we've seen visuals, we've seen pictures, people have committed suicide. It is a grave problem.
Indeed, it's a great problem, Shweta, but it operates at two levels to my mind. First and foremost, is it a directive or is there a abiding instruction that the banks have to follow? How do you define, sensitivity and humanity? Who will define that?
Absolutely.
Is that the bank manager whose KRA is to get his, loan converted into an NPA, converted it from an NPA into a performing asset? So, I guess, we need far more stringent, direction from the Finance Ministry, and more so from the Reserve Bank of India, on bringing about certain discipline in this particular activity. See, when you look at it from a bank's perspective, Shweta, we can't divorce that perspective as well. If someone has taken a loan and he or she is not paying up, then there is a challenge in terms of, how does that recovery happen? Now, the methods employed by some of the banks, especially the areas that you mentioned, the digital lending, infrastructure, and some private banks as well, and some very notable banks have also been seen erring on the wrong side of this. But it's equally incumbent upon people who take loans to follow a certain discipline in, paying up on time, so that this challenge doesn't arise in the first place.
Right.
Yes, it's a criminal offense to intimidate and bring in musclemen, and gunization of loan recovery is indeed a huge challenge. I hope the Finance Ministry's advice is not merely an advice. There is some strict monitoring and enforcement to see that these cases don't happen again.
You said something very interesting. I think my mind is still stick to it. You said, how do you really define humanity? How do you define sensitivity?
And who defines it?
And who defines it?
Absolutely.
I mean, what could be sensitive to you may not be sensitive to me. So
no, link it to the KRA of the bank manager.
Absolutely. And how they've grown up, to what level of sensitivities do they respond? Maybe harassing someone, calling them consistently is okay for one person, may not be okay for the other person.
No, and it goes back to the bottom of the challenge. So when you hand out loans, there is a huge urgency by all the banking system to try and bring in people without doing the due diligence. So if that due diligence is done in the right place, right at the beginning, you will notice, Shweta, that the capability of the person who's taking the loans to repay is somehow guaranteed. If you pick up a guy and pay a loan which at a level which he or she cannot pay back, and there is a challenge, but you still go ahead and pay the loan, and then all this machination comes into play. So it calls for not just sensitization across the board, it also calls for reworking the business model of all banks in place. The moment you hand out a loan, you have to be 100% sure in terms of your capability to judge that person's, I mean, tomorrow anything can happen. COVID happened, the best of the guys couldn't pay up. That was, uncertain times, unprecedented times. But outside of such unprecedented challenges, it is an imperative that the banking system or the entire, BFSI sector, whether it's paying for an insurance premium or whether it is, taking a loan for a car, being unable to repay back, or a house, the capability and the propensity of the Indian middle class to go for a loan is on the increase. I don't have the data. We have moved decadally from being a, savings economy to a debt-led economy. So if at the core of it, you're fueling your aspirations by taking loans, which is legitimate, but then you also need to, at the individual level, be sure that you are in a position to pay back and you have a certain discipline. For instance, credit cards, we've discussed it in the past. The moment you miss the payment cycle of initial payment or minimum payment, there is an additional charge that comes into play. That is the business model of the credit card. I mean, if they don't have those guys, so at one level they encourage people who can't follow that basic discipline. When there is a large chunk of such people who can't follow the basic discipline, when they make that mistake, they end up making another mistake of missing on the cycle also. So that leads to, it's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle.
And then finally, the bank wants to insulate itself. We have not done it. So they hire I have no shame in saying goons. And the goons' KRA is to get the money back.
One way or the other.
One way or the other. So that's pretty sad.
Absolutely. And come to think of it, and thinking of it from a bank's point of view, a financial lending point of view, we were having this discussion in the newsroom in the afternoon. It becomes a difficult conundrum for a bank if the government were to say, or the finance ministry were to say, be very cautious of who you are lending to. Then common man who may not have a lot of collateral to put in may not get the necessary loan they need, because obviously their payback capabilities are way lower. So on one hand you have people who are not getting the loan, and on the other hand you have people who have already availed the loan, not able to pay back, and banks go after them. The idea is, of course, to have a clean balance sheet for banks, because that is what we take a lot of pride in, because it's a very difficult conundrum to come out of.
As I said, at one level we have a large growing upwardly mobile, consumption class, which wants the best things for themselves overnight. They don't have the patience to wait till their, own wallet gets to the size that it can pick up things on their own. At the other level, the banks have flush with funds, so they want to hold out cash, and we have a situation where the payment cycles are not met, then there is a mismatch, and then this entire vicious cycle comes into play. So I repeat that the entire ecosystem has to transform to be able to bring in that discipline. I don't think collaterals are asked for everything. I mean, the first and the foremost is your current salary, 3 months pay slips, 6 months pay slips. This is the foundation, and then the CIBIL score. So I really don't know, maybe it's time to revisit the CIBIL score itself, because CIBIL score was said to be the litmus test. Does it continue to be the litmus test? I really don't know.
Interesting.
So,
point of view, yes.
When CIBIL doesn't come through as the real litmus test, what is the other test that you perform? For no occasion, not even for a second, am I legitimizing the employment of goons.
Right.
But then do believe that the bank has if the bank finally sends its report to the RBI, it will identify that particular loan having not been serviced as an NPA. So no bank is happy with that situation.
Right.
So P&L of the banks, capability of the individual to pick up a loan which he can afford to pay back, and then ultimately the kick-in of the unfair practices in terms of goons and So a whole lot of agencies need to work together.
Absolutely. And banking institutions, of course, walking a very fine line.
Absolutely.
Where to give out, where to dole out, where not to dole out, and once doled out, how to recover that money without harassing people.
So I do hope that the Finance Ministry's nudge is beyond the sentiment. One has to look at the real, so to say, the document. Beyond the parliamentary question that she said, I understand the ministry is quite seized of the matter. And what is their direction to RBI? I mean, is there a pivot to RBI? What is RBI's point of view? Why do these, what is the mechanism? Suppose you have a X percentage of loan default, what all does kick in? So, do collaterals kick in, or there's something else? So where does this goonism come into play, and how do we avoid that?
All right. How do we avoid goonism? Of course, nobody is in favor of that. The government has also taken note of the complaints that have been raised by various people who have perhaps been either harassed or not. But there is a stern message out there for banks, both private and public. You cannot harass customers if they're not able to pay back. I appreciate you both taking time out and joining me this afternoon. Good to have you in the newsroom once again,
I hope to be back soon.
Absolutely.